I'm going to, as is always the way when you speak after a few people, pick up some of the themes that have already come up. I'm going to say a little bit about the PRS as a whole. I'm going to say a little bit about the bad end of the PRS and acknowledge the challenges there. So kind of what's going on in the private rented sector? I think the first thing to say is it's part of the housing market as a whole. So issues around undersupply affect the private rented sector, long-run demographic issues affect the private rented sector. And the reason that that's key from my perspective is it means that anything you do with one part of the housing market spills over and affects the others, whether it's regulation, whether it's incentivising through the tax system. So the housing market as a whole, PRS is part of that. The other thing we know is a pretty effective market. So people talk about the buy-to-let boom, but it's really clear that buy-to-let met demand, didn't exceed it or outstrip it. That the balancing of kind of risk between landlords and tenants mostly works fairly well, and that mostly local landlords do a great job of providing for local housing need. And it's a pretty good small, medium enterprise business model, obviously, as many NLA members would themselves recognise. I think it's also worth saying that people like it. There isn't a very big difference, or any difference in a meaningful sense, in terms of tenant satisfaction between people that live in PRS properties, people that live in social housing, etc. So mostly it's doing a really good job. As David was saying, it's a lot of old stock and it's a lot of urban and suburban stock. So it's got a really important role to play as well in regeneration that I think is often overlooked. Who's in it? Well, more than 50% are very young. It looks young to me now that I'm over 35. They're mostly in work or higher education. They're mobile. They're a lot more mobile than people in the other 10 years, and they're mobile because they want to move. It's pretty clear that when people are moving around, it's because they are choosing to move, not because of problems with landlords. And I think it's also important to remember that the people in the private rented sector are making a different set of trade-offs, perhaps, than an owner-occupier between space and quality and location. So it's a characterisation, but young professionals will take a much smaller city centre letting because that makes a difference to them. Well, so what? I think for me, the best way to think of the private rented sector is that this is the lungs of the housing system. This is the thing that can stretch and change much more rapidly than other parts of the system. And in a time where what we're looking for is economic growth, I think that the private rented sector and landlords have an absolutely critical role to play because of that issue around mobility of young professionals. And I think coming at it from a can we make the PRS more like owner occupation is therefore probably the wrong thing to do. It's different people at a different life stage and they're doing different things. So some of the work we did in our housing market task force, we looked at this age-old issue of security of tenure. Can you create more security of tenure in the PRS? And found essentially no, you're going to drive good landlords out of the sector because it kind of changes the balance around risk and risk-taking. But you could look at more symmetrical longer-term contracts where more rights were given to both sides, but that should be voluntary rather than imposed. We also looked at this issue of regulation. It's not very often that you'll hear JRF say this, but came to the conclusion that, again, more regulation not hugely helpful here because roads break rules. There is a problem in a small minority of private rented sector businesses, but it is a minority, and regulating people who are already breaching rules doesn't work. So the issue, I very much agree with David, the issue in the vast majority of the PRS is about how do you incentivise good landlords. Now if you look at some of the really difficult end of the PRS, we did some work around housing and migration, and I think there are a few things to say here. In some ways it's not so different. Migrants are young, they're highly mobile, they're mostly working. So they're going in and out of those lungs, the kind of local labour markets, the regional labour markets. And they're mostly, or a lot of them, in the poor quality part of the sector because they don't know how to access the good quality part of the sector. And there's more pressure, more distortion coming in through things like housing homeless households in the private rented sector and through the single room rents. There's a lot of competition in that part of the sector now as well. And that's going to play out in local labour markets and local housing markets. And I'm sure Richard will pick this up in the context of London. But there's a fantastic example in Thetford, which is kind of surrounded by a lot of farming areas and food production areas. The number of HMOs went from 40 to 400 in 4 years. So there's something incredibly quick and hard to kind of control going on in some of the labour markets, and that's putting real pressure on that lower end of the PRS. So what do you do? Well, there's the enforcement piece here, I think is really important, targeted enforcement. But there's also still real opportunities to incentivise. So we would say supporting migrants to access the mainstream sector, supporting mainstream landlords to understand and provide more access to migrants. And there are great examples of schemes that have done that, whether it's Northampton local lettings, or things like Sandhills Brushstroke project, where refugee charities provided support to landlords who were interested in housing migrants. So again, it's this piece about how do you incentivise more of the kind of good provision, and how do you make it easier for migrants who are moving and working to access housing that meets their needs.